Welcome to Daily Dose of Knowledge. Nobody is born hating studying. That aversion was created by the wrong conditions, the wrong framing, and a brain that was never taught how to work with itself. Stay with us and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every student who struggles to open a textbook is not lazy. Their brain is making a completely rational decision based on the information it has been given. And that information can be changed. This is not about discipline. It is not about motivation. It is about understanding how the brain assigns value and using that understanding to rewire the experience of studying from the inside. Let's start with why studying feels painful in the first place. The brain operates on a reward prediction system. Before committing energy to any task, it runs a quick cost-benefit calculation. How much effort does this require? What reward is coming? How soon? Studying scores badly on all three. High effort, distant reward, no immediate payoff. The brain is not being irrational. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do: conserve energy and prioritize immediate returns. Studying just happens to look like a terrible investment from where the brain is standing. Now let's talk about dopamine, because this is where the real mechanism lives. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. That is one of the most repeated misconceptions in popular science. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical. It is released not when you receive a reward, but when you expect one. This distinction changes everything. Because if dopamine fires on anticipation, then the goal is not to make studying feel rewarding after the fact. The goal is to make the brain anticipate reward before and during the work. Now let's talk about the first method, and it works directly on the dopamine system. Implementation intentions. A technique backed by over 200 published studies. Most people study with a vague plan. I will study today. I will get to it later. The brain has no specific cue to trigger the behavior, so the behavior never starts. Implementation intentions replace vague plans with precise if-then statements. When X happens, I will do Y. When I sit down at my desk at 5 p.m., I will open my notes for exactly 20 minutes. The specificity of the cue activates a neurological process called prospective memory encoding. The brain preloads the behavior into the relevant context. When the cue arrives, the action fires more automatically. Research by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer at NYU showed implementation intentions increase follow-through rates by 200 to 300% compared to simple intention setting. You are not relying on motivation. You are programming a trigger. Now let's talk about the second method, temptation bundling. Behavioral economist Katherine Milkman at the University of Pennsylvania developed and tested this concept extensively. The idea is simple. You pair a high-effort, low-enjoyment activity, studying, with something your brain genuinely craves. A specific playlist only played during study sessions. A favorite drink only consumed while working. A comfortable environment reserved exclusively for study time. Over time, the brain begins associating the studying context with the pleasurable element. The cue that triggers the craving begins to also trigger engagement with the work. This is classical conditioning applied deliberately. You are not tricking the brain with false promises. You are giving it a real reward, attached to the real work, until the association forms. Milkman's research showed participants who used temptation bundling exercised 51% more frequently than the control group. The same principle transfers directly to studying. Now let's talk about the third method, and this one targets the brain's core aversion mechanism directly. The 2-minute rule combined with implementation intentions. The brain's primary resistance to studying is not the studying itself. It is the starting. The anticipation of effort before effort has actually begun is almost always worse than the effort itself. Neuroscientists call this the effort paradox. The predicted cost of a task is consistently higher than the actual experienced cost once the task is underway. The 2-minute rule exploits this. You commit only to 2 minutes of studying, nothing more. The bar is so low that the brain's cost-benefit calculation approves it. Once 2 minutes have passed, the brain is already engaged. The task is underway. Stopping now requires more mental effort than continuing. The momentum carries forward. This works because task engagement itself produces dopamine, not just completion, engagement. The brain begins releasing reward signals as soon as meaningful progress begins. You are not tricking the brain with a false promise. You are getting it past the starting threshold where the real reward system kicks in. Now let's talk about environment design, because the space you study in is not neutral. The brain is extraordinarily sensitive to contextual cues. Every environment you spend time in accumulates behavioral associations. Your bed signals sleep. Your couch signals rest. Your phone signals stimulation. If you study in the same place you relax, the brain receives competing signals. The environment is telling it to rest, while the task is telling it to work. The conflict drains cognitive resources before a single word is read. Dedicated study environments resolve this. A specific chair, desk, or space used exclusively for studying becomes a contextual trigger. The brain associates that location with cognitive work and begins preparing for it upon arrival. Research in environmental psychology confirms that context-dependent memory is one of the most powerful forces in human learning. Information encoded in a specific environment is more easily retrieved in that same environment. Your study space is not just furniture. It is a neurological cue. Now let's talk about the fourth method, retrieval practice. And this one does something the others don't. Most students study by rereading. Rereading feels productive. It produces a sensation of familiarity, and the brain interprets familiarity as learning. It is not learning. It is recognition. Recognition and recall are completely different neurological processes. Retrieval practice, testing yourself on material rather than rereading it, forces the brain to actively reconstruct information from memory. That reconstruction process strengthens the neural pathways involved. Psychologists call this the testing effect. A landmark study by Roediger and Karpik showed that students who studied using retrieval practice retained 50% more information 1 week later than students who reread the same material. The discomfort of retrieval practice, the feeling of struggling to remember, is not a sign that it is not working. That struggle is the learning. The difficulty is the mechanism. Rereading feels easier because it is easier. And it produces worse results because of that. Now let's talk about spacing, because when you study matters as much as how. The spacing effect is one of the most replicated findings in cognitive psychology. Distributing study sessions across time produces dramatically better retention than cramming the same total hours into one session. When you revisit material after a delay, the brain has to work harder to retrieve it. That retrieval effort strengthens the memory trace. The forgetting and relearning cycle is not inefficiency. It is the process. Cramming works for immediate recall. Within 24 to 48 hours, the material collapses. Spaced repetition produces memories that last months and years. The implication is practical. 30 minutes of studying today and 30 minutes in 3 days produces better retention than 60 minutes in one sitting, always. Now let's talk about the identity shift, because this is the layer underneath all the techniques. Every technique in this video works at the behavioral level. But beneath behavior is identity. And identity drives behavior more powerfully than any technique. The student who tells themselves, "I am bad at studying," is not describing a fact. They are issuing an instruction to their brain. And the brain follows instructions. Research by psychologist Carol Dweck on growth mindset showed that students who were taught their abilities were fixed performed significantly worse than students who understood their abilities were developable. The belief about the brain changes the brain's behavior, not metaphorically, neurologically. The reframe is not "I need to study more." It is "I am someone who finds this interesting. I am someone who is building this skill." The brain will resist what conflicts with its self-concept and support what aligns with it. Give the brain a new identity to protect, and it will start working for you instead of against you. Here is the final piece, and it is the one that makes everything else sustainable. Progress visibility. The brain is a progress detection machine. Visible progress produces dopamine. Invisible progress produces nothing, even when real learning is happening. Study logs, completion tracking, flashcard decks growing smaller. These are not productivity theater. They are dopamine triggers. They make the invisible work of learning visible in a form the brain can reward.